So children, we were doing lesson 6 from your supplementary reader book, Moments, Weathering the Storm in Ersama. In the previous video, we have seen how Prashant, a 19-year-old boy from Kolikuda, got trapped at his friend's house at Ersama. The devastation caused by the super cyclone continued for 36 hours. When water started rising inside the house, they took refuge on the roof of the house, and Prashant's only thought was about the well-being of his family at Kolikuda. So when the rain stopped, Prashant decided to find his family, and he prepared for his 18-kilometer long expedition. He took a long sturdy stick and started his journey for Kolikuda. So now let's read further and find out whether he was able to complete the difficult journey and was united with his family. Weathering the Storm in Ersama by Harsh Mandir. As they waded through the waters, the scenes they witnessed grew more and more macabre. They had to push away many human bodies, men, women, children, and carcasses of dogs, goats, and cattle that the current swept against them as they moved ahead. In every village that they passed, they could barely see a house standing. Prashant now wept out loud and long. He was sure that his family could not have survived this catastrophe. Waded means walk with effort through water. Macabre, disturbing because concerned with or causing a fear of death. Catastrophe means a disaster. Moving through flood waters, they saw horrifying scenes. Dead bodies of humans and animals had to be pushed away many times to make their way. Every village they passed had barely a house left. Prashant wept loudly for a long time on witnessing such gory scenes. He was sure that his family was no more. Eventually, Prashant reached his village, Kolikuda. His heart went cold. Where their homes once stood, there were only remnants of its roof. Some of their belongings were caught, mangled and twisted in the branches of trees, just visible above the dark waters. Young Prashant decided to go to the Red Cross shelter to look for his family. Remnants means remains. Eventually, Prashant reached Kolikuda, and his heart sank, for he could see only the remnants of the roof of his house, remains of the roof of his house. He decided to go to Red Cross shelter to look for his family. Among the first people he saw in the crowd was his maternal grandmother. Weak with hunger, she rushed to him, her hands outstretched, her eyes brimming. It was a miracle. They had long given him up for dead. Quickly, word spread, and his extended family gathered around him and hugged him tight in relief. Prashant anxiously scanned the motley, battered group. His brother and sister, his uncles and aunts, they all seemed to be there. There he could spot his maternal grandmother, who was weak with hunger. Teary-eyed, she rushed to him with outstretched hands. Quickly, the news of Prashant's arrival spread, and more members of his family gathered around him. It was a miracle for them to see Prashant, as they had thought him to be dead. Brimming means be full to the point of overflowing, just about to flow. Motley means incongruously varied in appearance, battered, injured by repeated blows. By the next morning, as he took in the desperate situation in the shelter, he decided to get a grip over himself. He sensed a deadly grief settling upon the 2,500 strong crowd in the shelter. 86 lives were lost in the village. All the 96 houses had been washed away. It was their fourth day at the shelter. So far, they had survived on green coconuts, but there were too few to go around such a tumult of people. Tumult means a loud, confused noise, especially one caused by a large mass of people. Next morning, Prashant grasped the situation of the shelter and noticed that 2,500 people over there were in grief. 86 people of his village had died and 96 houses had been washed away, and everyone had been in this shelter since the past 4 days. So far, they had survived on green coconuts, which too were to finish soon. Prashant, all of 19 years, decided to step in as leader of his village if no one else did. He organized a group of youths and elders to jointly pressurize the merchant once again to part with his rice. This time, the delegation succeeded and returned triumphantly, wading through the receding waters with food for the entire shelter. No one cared that the rice was already rotting. Branches from the fallen trees were gathered to light a reluctant and slow fire on which to cook the rice. For the first time in 4 days, the survivors at the cyclone shelter were able to fill their bellies. His next task was to organize a team of youth volunteers to clean the shelter of filth, urine, vomit, and floating carcasses, and to tend to the wounds and fractures of the many who had been injured. Delegation means a body of representatives. Triumphantly means in a way that shows great happiness at a victory or achievement. Reluctant means unwilling and hesitant. The young boy decided to lead the hungry and tired people in this moment of crisis. He organized a group of youths and elders to put pressure on the village merchant to give them rice. This effort succeeded this time, and the group returned to the shelter with food for everyone. Although the rice was already rotten, but the hungry crowd did not mind that. Broken branches were gathered to cook the rice, and people ate for the first time in 4 days. As the wood were all wet, it was difficult to light them. That's why it's mentioned, light a reluctant and slow fire. The next task was to clean the filth that had got collected in the shelter and tend to the wounds and fractures of the injured. On the fifth day, a military helicopter flew over the shelter and dropped some food parcels. It then did not return. The youth task force gathered empty utensils from the shelter. Then they deputed the children to lie in the sand left by the waters around the shelter with these utensils on their stomachs to communicate to the passing helicopters that they were hungry. The message got through, and after that the helicopter made regular rounds of the shelter, airdropping food and other basic needs. So here you can see how intelligently this boy worked to get the attention of the relief helicopters. Prashant found that a large number of children had been orphaned. He brought them together and put up a polythene sheet shelter for them. Women were mobilized to look after them, while the men secured food and materials for the shelter. Mobilized means prepared and organized for active service. So here you can see Prashant took great care of each and every person in the shelter. He gathered the orphan children, put them together, and women were made to take care of them, while He activated the men to secure food and other materials for the shelter. As the weeks passed, Prashant was quick to recognize that the women and children were sinking deeper and deeper in their grief. He persuaded the women to start working in the Food for Work program started by an NGO, and for the children, he organized sports events. He himself loved to play cricket, and so he organized cricket matches for children. Prashant engaged with other volunteers in helping the widows and children to pick up the broken pieces of their lives. Weeks passed and Prashant noticed that people were becoming depressed. He persuaded women to start working in a Food for Work program that had been started by an NGO. He organized sports events for children. He himself loved cricket, so he organized cricket matches. Prashant, along with other volunteers, helped the widows and children to resume normal life. The initial government plan was to set up institutions for orphans and widows. However, this step was successfully resisted, as it was felt that in such institutions, children would grow up without love and would suffer from stigma and loneliness. Prashant's group believed orphans should be resettled in their own community itself, possibly in new foster families made up of childless widows and children without adult care. His group successfully resisted the government's plan to set up institutions for orphans and widows. The reason behind was they believed that in such institutions children would grow up without love and widows would suffer from loneliness and stigma. They decided to settle them in their own communities in new foster families made up of childless widows and orphaned children. It is 6 months after the devastation of the super cyclone. This time, Prashant's wounded spirit has healed simply because he had no time to bother about his own pain. His handsome youth face is what the widows and orphaned children of his village seek out most in their darkest hour of grief. Lesson by Harsh Mandir. 6 months after the destructive super cyclone, Prashant forgot his own sorrow of being a motherless boy. His handsome face is a source of light for the orphans and widows in his village. Now let's look at the message that this lesson gives. The story gives the message of brotherhood and compassion. Every human life has to face its share of difficulties. However, working for the welfare of the underprivileged is the noblest deed. Prashant worked tirelessly to bring food, shelter, and normalcy to the lives of those who were left without family and home. He brought together those who suffered a similar tragedy and launched a commendable mission of rehabilitating the cyclone victims. The life of Prashant is a message about survival amidst odds owing to the spirit of brotherhood. So with the message of brotherhood and compassion, the chapter of weathering the storm is over. Thank you children. I hope you understood the lesson well.